I want to ask Carolyn something. Maybe our conference is 6 months, a year, or 2 years too early to answer some of those questions that you've been engaging. We've had the distortion of the pandemic, and we just embarked on bringing in money to build chip plants in Austin and get Ford battery plants in Ohio and Tennessee. Maybe soon we'll see changes that won't fit into your paradigm, or are you pretty convinced that we don't really have to take into account too much the distortions of pandemic? You know, held back demand, surge in trade, boats backing up at the port of Long Beach.
I think it's possible, yes. I think it will take extreme policy measures and be hugely costly. So that's the point I really wanted to get across, that it doesn't happen easy and overnight, oh, we're just gonna reshore and nearshore some stuff and jobs are gonna come back. Trump's tariffs have been in place since 2017. And all they've really done is shifted our imports away from China to China's neighbors. So maybe that's worth doing because we're worried about China. So I'm not saying that's a policy we shouldn't do, but it didn't bring a heck of a lot of stuff home. And I think it is possible. Of course, we could close the borders immediately and we'll have to produce everything ourselves. But it's going to be costly for what we consume in terms of varieties, for the prices of those products, and really for growth around the world. So the poorest people in the world aren't in the US. They're in developing countries around the world who, if you're in a really small country without a lot of income, the best way to grow is selling stuff to the big markets abroad, and you need intermediates from those countries to be able to make stuff. So it's going to have huge costs here and even bigger costs in the rest of the world.
Simon, let me just ask you about a small thing just to clarify. I think I'm going to anticipate a question from the audience on this and then maybe a bigger question. How come India is on your list of autocracies? It's a democracy, and we may disagree with Modi's government and so forth, but there must be specific ways that you think about that.
There are. I mean, I thought about this too, and it is true that India is a formal democracy. There are some people who have argued that it has moved increasingly away from being a formal democracy to a liberal democracy to what you might call a formalistic democracy. You could say the same really about Turkey too. Right? And so some people will put them in they'll put them together. Really what will drive those results, I mean, India and Turkey do use a lot of subsidies, but China is so much bigger anyway that's going to be a big part of what drives those numbers.
So do you feel that the project to highlight the real data here and to urge trade negotiators, concerned public, elected officials to consider the elephant in the room that seems to be subsidies, is it moving the needle? Are we getting the vocabulary to change a bit?
So if you asked me that question 3 or 4 years ago, no one really wanted to talk about subsidies. They were not persuaded it was a problem. Subsidies in agriculture have always been a problem. We're talking here about subsidies in manufacturing, okay? This has changed in the last 3 or 4 years, big time. Partly that is the availability of a lot more data, and we made all of our data available to people so they could go through and check it. So we put that out. So we were very transparent about this. I think a lot of people, I don't want to claim that it was just us. A lot of people were trying to understand where the critique of the WTO was going. And then I think a lot of people realized that subsidies were more of a problem than they had previously thought. So there's kind of, I think, more of a convergence there.
It might be more than that now, right? Subsidies are in. They're cool. I mean, look at Biden.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, yeah. So they were, 2 or 3 years ago, people said, yeah, this is a worrying thing. And now with Biden's latest policies with the IRA, this is now being seen as being the thing to do. Of course, let's be clear, Europe had its CHIPS Act and its own green energy subsidies before. So it's not, let's not point the finger only at Washington.
So it was a bit of glass. You were seeing a glass house at Davos a couple weeks ago when the Europeans went, wait, what's with these subsidies?
Sure.
Yeah. You've been terrific on a particular point, but stay excellent on this point. On your questions, keep them pithy, because some people have asked me to try to repeat the question, and I have the retention of a flea. So help me on that. So volunteer number 3, we have a question. Tell us your name.
Jim Matlack, Camden. Did Donald Trump ever really understand that when he imposed a tariff, the domestic consumers paid that rather than the importing country?
Did the public understand that this awesome tool to get back at Chinese people we pay for?
Yeah, so actually there's been a ton of work on that, and he kept saying the Chinese pay, but there are several economic studies that have been published now in top journals showing that consumers pay. So of course they do. But I would say it's not necessarily it's Americans that pay, or America that pay, but not necessarily when you buy something in the store, because the intermediary, the Walmart that buys the stuff may not pass it on to the consumer, which I think was happening initially. Now, as price pressures have gone up, a lot of that's getting passed through.
It's just that Trump didn't seem to understand the basic facts of what happens when a tariff is imposed.
He also didn't understand the basic facts, as Doug was talking about earlier, about balance of payments, that trade deficits are not reduced by tariffs. So a tariff will not help a trade deficit. You need to affect investment and savings for that to change.
Volunteer 1 has someone picked out. Tell us your name.
I'm Jonathan. I live about half a mile from here. I'd like to probe Simon's data a bit. How much of the subsidies was Defense Department related? And how much of the subsidies to specific companies were Defense Department related? Because most subsidies are industry directed, and defense spending is a different category than what I would consider sort of mainline manufacturing.
So yeah, the question is, do you have data about to what extent military spending plays out in this?
So when we put out our subsidies report a few years ago, we broke out which agencies were responsible. And the Defense Department is a small fraction of the numbers for the U.S. subsidies. So you have the U.S. Exim Bank, the Agriculture Department, the Small Business Administration. You have the Energy Department as well, and now you have more subsidies from the Commerce Department. So yeah, it's not just the Pentagon.
Energy is solar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Energy, lots of different types of energy, and renewables, and as well as nuclear. You have lots of stuff in energy now.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We'll stay with volunteer 1. Is there a raised hand on this side?
Good morning. I'm Mel Mackay from Camden. I have a question for Professor Evenett. The more you took us through your slides and we moved from focus on tariffs to subsidies, the more I began to be concerned that subsidy might be, in some cases at least, a smokescreen for corruption. Can you comment on that? Is there a concern as things become less and less transparent that there's an invitation, whether in our economy or in others, an invitation toward much more corruption in the way we're doing business?
Well, if we step back, a subsidy or a financial incentive is a grant by a government in some form to a firm. And now the terms upon which that money can be given might be corrupt or not, and whether or not a firm lives up to the conditions for receiving the money, which is, I think, a separate question. So that type of malfeasance is possible too. So yeah, I think once you put these things on the table, yes, they are possible. We don't go through and check whether or not there are, whether a transaction was corrupt or whether the conditions were finally met. But I can understand why a taxpayer would be interested in that question, and so it's good that you ask it.
And Simon, part of what you're saying is that in the debate over trade, your data hadn't been considered, but subsidies are often not secret. They're of, like if you want to know who's getting subsidized, often it's a matter of public record in the U.S., would you say?
So if you give me a minute, I'll explain this because I think this is a fascinating story. You can get quite a lot of subsidy data from the federal government. It's not in a form which is easy to add up or compare, okay? In fact, we spend months putting it together. When we published the subsidies, we published our report. I had 3 Zoom sessions with officials in different US government departments. Some of them were really surprised that we'd managed to do this, to assemble it. So that's point one. So that's that. So it's, to the extent that the US is transparent, it's at the federal level. Where the US is not transparent at the federal level is who receives the tax breaks from the federal tax code.
Really?
All we have is the totals that have been paid. That's released by the Treasury every year. So there's an area of non-transparency. The biggest area of non-transparency in the United States are tax breaks by cities and states, where some cities and states report this information, many do not. They are under an obligation to report, which they routinely violate. Bear this all in mind whenever you hear anyone talk about how non-transparent Chinese subsidies are.
Though I would still say Chinese subsidies are a lot less transparent than the US.
Okay, so it could be a matter of degree.
And for all you muckraking journalists out there, it seems like a wonderful, lush way to guide your early career is looking into who's getting tax breaks where you live if it's not being declared. Fascinating. We have a remote question now. Justine from Foxcroft Academy asks, how do we reconcile the fact that trade is critical for the environment, yet shipping's impact on the environment is negative? We'll have more comments tomorrow about some of the environmental effects, but you addressed this in your presentation, that there also can be beneficial effects of trade, even factoring in the carbon footprint of moving things around.
Yeah, the carbon footprint of moving things around is actually pretty small. And not only that, but it's remained constant over time despite the growth in trade because shipping has gotten so much more efficient. So I think we should worry about it, and shipping fuel happens to be one of the most nasty fuels around, so I think we should worry about it, and we should think about slower moving ships and potentially renewables at some point. But that's a really small part of it compared to using resources to produce things where it's not productive. Also, when you think about all the green goods and the need to produce those new renewables, whether wind turbines or solar panels, et cetera, you really need trade for that. I think the biggest concern is not shipping, it's that the dirty industries move to where there aren't taxes on carbon or regulations, and especially and that's the reason you want to have the words that Doug mentioned earlier, the carbon border adjustment tax, is that if we start imposing more taxes, or Europe does in their regulations, industry will shift to other places, and it'll be just as bad for the globe if things are still being produced in poor ways, plus the transport. So you need always to adjust for that to put everyone on a level playing field.
I mean, you can see why some of this is counterintuitive and why a student would ask the question, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't wait to grow strawberries in your strawberry patch here in Maine, and you get it from South America in the winter, there's a carbon impact that based on your availability because of trade that seems detrimental. I guess counteracted by, in your talk, you talked about the dairy cows in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the same as trying to produce avocados in the winter in Maine, I think would be really require so much greenhousing and this and that it's probably cheaper, better even for the environment and cheaper to import from elsewhere.
They got some groovy greenhouses up here, though, that do work fairly well. Let's see here. Is there volunteer 3?
I'm John Campbell from Bend, Oregon, and I'd just like to ask Professor Freund, you mentioned that the Chinese trade is diminishing in favor of neighbors in Asia. How much of that is Chinese capital that ultimately inures back to the benefit of the Chinese economy?
How much of the trade is capital?
Is Chinese capital.
Chinese capital investing into Indonesia, which then results in a benefit to the Chinese economy.
That is a great question, and I think it's the next thing to start looking into. And Peter's article, and we, as I think I mentioned before, we were recently in Mexico, and it is a lot of Chinese capital actually going to Mexico. My guess is it's a lot of Chinese capital going to other parts, but I don't have data on that right now. But I think that, so it still is accruing to Chinese firms and maintains some of the dependence there and doesn't slow China's growth as much as Washington might be hoping it does.
By the way, we're batting 4-0 on every single presentation. I don't know about Simon's, but if you count the two of you together, the theme of, to quote you back, Carolyn, one thing we didn't do are the redistributive policies to help people adjust. As good business-oriented, freer traders, don't like the smell of something that looks a whole lot like that socialism stuff.
Well, no, and I think Peter mentioned this last night, and it's my view as well. The Nordic economies have done it really well. They're really, really open, great business environment, but if companies move or things go out of business, there's a social safety net for them. And we just need a much stronger social safety net here. We had much higher taxes historically in the 50s and 60s when we were growing really fast. We used to have inheritance taxes. We've gotten rid of those. No reason that the children of people who made it big should benefit just by the luck of birth. So I think we could tax a lot more and redistribute more. And that's, again, why it's almost a uniquely Anglo phenomenon. It's US, UK, Australia, where you've seen this huge rise in inequality in response to changes in the world.
Volunteer 3, there's one on the side for some geographical diversity here.
My name's Joe Gutentag from South Bristol, Maine. When many of these agreements, multinational, national, were adopted, say go back to the 70s, our global economy consisted of possibly 75% manufactured goods and 25% services, approximately. Those figures have now been completely reversed. How does that affect what you've just been talking about? Is that a relevant question?
How does the shift to services from manufacturing affect our discussion?
Well, it affects it in the sense that manufacturing is much, much more tradable. So when we think about trade, 80% of trade is goods trade. So it's not just manufacturing, it's also natural resources and agriculture and things like that. But goods, it's hard to buy your haircut in China. So trade is mainly goods. It's now becoming services as well, with transcription services and other things that can be traded electronically. So I think services We keep waiting, though, for services trade to boom, and it keeps not happening. So I'm optimistic it's going to happen more now, but trade has just been more historically in goods. So that's why there's such a focus. And then manufacturing is really special for growth. So there's tons of economic studies showing that manufacturing just has this extraordinary effect on getting countries to grow that you don't see as much in services. Potentially because you can target this foreign market and incorporate technology from those places. I don't know if you'd add anything.
So you started your question by making the link to the agreements that were signed. So over the years, services matters have been discussed more in trade agreements, but there's a big difference with manufacturing, and that is that most services are regulated domestically, and the domestic regulators are in many democracies are independent, and they are not that keen on cooperating with other regulators. So the willingness to create the same sort of architecture of trade rules, which are binding in the same way, has been much less. So that, I think, has held back the development of the rules. And Carolyn's identified reasons why the amount of cross-border services might not have grown as quickly too.
And there's an interesting wrinkle domestically within the United States on this, not quite the scope of this conference, but rules governing services within states are like enormously protectionist.
Yeah.
And we've done some reporting on, it takes, I think, in Nevada, 1,200 hours to get an optician's license. And in California, it takes 0 hours. And the level of blindness is not higher in Nevada. But it certainly may help Nevada opticians once you have the license. We have a remote question here from Westport Island. Davies Allen asks for us to talk a little bit about how has the effectiveness of the World Trade Organization changed over the past 10 years? And we've been coming at this from different angles.
You're in Switzerland. You start. Then I'll
So this is a question which will get me into big trouble back home, because of course we have the WTO there. We're all very proud of it. The structured answer to this question is, as a place to negotiate, the WTO stopped functioning about 10 years ago. Yeah? As a place to settle disputes between countries, unfortunately, that's been seriously impaired too. Partly by a number of administrations, but U.S. administrations.
Sort of vividly the Trump administration, though, right?
Yeah, but Obama started vetoing judge appointments before. And by the way, no one knows this, but the first...
One is here.
One is here. The first judge to be vetoed was actually by the European Union. So the EU started this game, and then the US picked up on it. So as a place to settle disputes, it's in abeyance. As a place to monitor, well, you've seen our results, so they're not doing a very good job there. As a place to figure out where to go next in the trading system, they have trouble even agreeing who should chair committees, let alone having the committees meet. I mean, it's pretty grim. Let's put it this way, there's plenty of room for potential for improvement.
Says a professor. He's written that on many of a paper. What were you going to say?
So I would just give one anecdote to this, which is I was recently in Switzerland for a conference and was with a bunch of WTO folks, and they were complaining that the building is really, really cold. And the reason it's cold is because they had money left over because there was no travel during COVID. So they asked to keep the money because no one's investing in the WTO now that was left over from their just operating budget from travel. And India vetoed them keeping it. So now they don't have heating for the building. So that's how bad it is at the WTO now.
So, I mean, a logical next question would be, but you can see the problem, is it time to start afresh and build a different institution? But then you'd have to find people interested in doing that.
Yeah, that's a super hard question. I mean, we have these institutions, and you can say the same really about some of the other institutions, global institutions as well. I think it's really hard to have institutions where China and US are both the two leading countries in the world and they're not getting along. And so do we need to create, the only institutions that are functioning now seem to be the ones made up of friends. So I think that is the million-dollar question. Do we need new institutions? You're not going to touch that one.
Volunteer one, you've got a question right near you.
I'll touch on that one.
Tell us your name.
Virginia Manuel from Hamden. We're hearing a lot about the former Trump administration in these discussions so far. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the Biden administration, their trade policies, and how they differ from the Trump administration going forward.
Yeah, this, does the Biden administration differ substantially from Trump? It's been suggested not much, right? Simon?
So I agree in terms of what they have not changed. I agree. Biden took on much of what Trump has done, has kept it, and then has added more, especially with respect to relations with China. Last year, my second point is last year the Americans were reviewed at the WTO in their trade policy review, and I produced a chart of how much trade was covered by Biden administration measures in the first 2 years versus Trump. And Biden is much worse. There's much more trade distortions and much less trade reform. And it comes out very starkly in the data. So this is an administration which is, I think, acting purposefully with much less razzmatazz than the previous one, but they have a very deliberate policy of not opening up US markets and of whacking China.
And it's not only whacking China. I think Trump had the hammer out and said a lot of stuff. Biden's gone for the scalpel. And so the export controls that have come into place are hurting China much more than the tariffs ever did. And the access to semiconductors, the access to tools to make semiconductors, the export controls are really, 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 really sharp and trading with certain foreign entities. So it's the subsidies, it's weird because we're emulating China with these subsidies, but then at the same time, I guess we're also emulating China with the export controls because they tried that on the rare earths that they control. So it's actually much more severe with much less rhetoric.
It's interesting because we'll talk more later today and tomorrow about the politics of this. But if you're going to make the case, this is to play to a populace.
No, I think they really don't like China. I don't think it's to play to a populace.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
I think they're afraid of China in Washington.
Maybe there are reasons. Volunteer 3, what do you got?
Samuel again from UMaine. I have two sets of questions for Mrs. Caroline. So the first one is from the slides. I realized FDI from both the US and China. China was kind of, it goes down and comes up, but that of the US was kind of stable and smooth. If you could tell me what accounts for that. And then next question is...
you know what, I'll go back to you because I won't be able to remember your second question. You're referring to what did you say?
FDI.
Foreign direct investment?
Yes.
Yeah. What accounts for that?
So the decline that was there was like right around COVID, if I recall correctly, where everything just sort of stopped. But if you just, I think with FDI, it's a little bit lumpy because big investments happen, all of a sudden, and there'll be a huge amount. So I wouldn't focus on those fluctuations, but rather the fact that you don't see it falling off. So foreigners are still investing in China, foreigners are still investing in the US.
And the second part?
The second question, in your last slides, you spoke of globalization, and you made mention of it helping increase variety and lowering lower prices and then reducing risk. With that, I believe with you. I side with you. But with the issue of global growth and inequality, we can still see that there is a wide gap. between growth and inequality, especially between the global north and global south. And we are saying globalization is really helping increase growth and then inequality. Is that not kind of conflicting? And then since you work with the World Bank, I was hoping if you could speak a little about how the World Bank measures inequality, because I believe using the same metric for the West, I mean the metric we use for the West in measuring inequality and growth, if we are to use the same metric for the LDCs, we would probably be making a mistake.
So measures of growth, we'll get to that in a second, but gaps between growth and inequality?
So, before the period of hyperglobalization and when I was in graduate school, the big story was convergence never happened. So poor countries should be growing faster than rich countries. Then globalization came in, and those countries that really were able to expand their exports were the stars, were the superstars. And they're the ones that were catching up. So you did start to see convergence of poor countries to rich countries. Now, I'll take your point that it didn't happen everywhere. And Africa in particular has lagged, parts of Latin America, parts of South Asia, but they're all countries where you don't see this kind of export-led growth. So we still had more convergence during that period, and even in those countries than in the prior one. Then on the inequality measurement, we use at the World Bank all the same measures that everybody uses: the Herfindahl index, the share of the top 1%, the share of the top 10%. There's lots of measures you can use. They all tend to move in the same direction. There's inequality within countries, which I would say probably there's others here who know more than I, but has been increasing, in lots of countries. But what I was focusing on was global inequality. So if you did that measure for the whole world, you actually do see a decline in that period of hyperglobalization, precisely because the poor countries were getting richer. So the average incomes and even the incomes in those countries were rising enough that global inequality from a world perspective as opposed to a country perspective was falling. You can have every country have inequality rise while global inequality actually falls. So it's possible for that to happen as long as the poor countries are getting richer.
We have time for a last question from the audience, and then I have to ask Carolyn one side thing that just to elucidate something that she had, because I'm feeling that you still had a question about it. Volunteer one, you get to choose who gets it. Uh-oh. Wait, how many hands were there?
There's one in the front.
Oh, okay. All right, let's take two more, but let's keep them tight because we're getting hungry. Hi.
Hi, I'm Wendy Grossman. I'm from Walpole, New Hampshire. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what the definition of subsidy is, because there are many different ways in which you could define it. And essentially subsidy it's an anti-tax, but you could define basically differences in tax rates between countries as being subsidies. You can also talk about differences in regulations. For example, China in some effect is subsidizing, or the US is penalizing its manufacturers by the Chinese having more lax environmental policies, more lax worker safety protections. Which of these factors do you think are most important in affecting global trade? And how would you talk about what's your actual, how you should define subsidies?
So, Simon, this is what you've spent a lot of time worrying about. What were you looking for?
So we hewed very much to the traditional way that they deal with this issue of the WTO, where a subsidy is defined as a benefit that's conferred on a firm by a state. All right? So that's your classic. You receive a tax break, you receive a payment, you might get some land given to you. All of these, that's the sense in which we used it. We did not use the broader definition, which came in the question here, which is to see any type of difference maybe in regulation or taxes across countries as being forms of subsidy. So that, I understand some people take that viewpoint. That would be an even broader viewpoint than we took, in that, you know, the numbers for distorted trade would be even correspondingly larger, okay? So we took a narrower view, which is close to where, how the diplomats look at this, and that's not to say that's the only way to look at it.
And then, to be fair, wasn't there a hand, volunteer one? Oh, right here. Yeah, and someone we'll see more of soon, Dr. Otter.
Yes.
David Otter, Cambridge, Massachusetts. So a subtext of both your talks is sort of, chiding countries and politicians for engaging in anti-trade behavior and so on. And I don't disagree, but I guess my question is, do you think to any degree the economics profession and economics advice is partly responsible for the trade backlash that we're in? Because I study the same things you do, and we all know that we were taught the religion of trade and how beneficial it was, and we also was noted occasionally, oh yeah, but it has some redistributive effects, but those are second order. Those didn't turn out to be second order, and I don't know if politicians were really warned of that.
Can we blame economists?
So, yes, and yes. No, just to say, I think, and when I was in graduate school, that's what we learned. You know, the growth is so big, the pie gets bigger. Oh, there are these redistributive things, but they're easily taken care of with the fact that the pie is bigger. But then politicians didn't really do that, and we as economists just kept talking the trade game. So I take that point. I would say I think we've gone in the other direction now, and we're acting as if redistribution is much more important than making the pie bigger. And at this point, you know, as Paul Krugman said, if we rolled in the car, we hit the pedestrian and drove over them, backing up over them isn't going to help. And that's kind of where we are now. So I'm not sure what the best way is to take this discussion.
Okay, now we're about to break, but I just got to, just because it was kind of sitting there for a moment. You were making a point earlier, Carolyn, about it's not just globalization that could have contributed to widening inequality in the world. And you kind of threw a little bomb in there and said, it was the way we breed these days. What were you talking about?
So in the past, and I do think women should work, but in the past when women didn't work as much, when a couple got together, married, and had kids, inequality didn't increase. But now when a doctor marries a doctor and a lawyer marries a lawyer, and people tend to marry people of their same economic class, that has big inequality effects because you're doubling these really high incomes.
Interesting. Sounds like a story I have to look into more for the.
There's a literature on it.
Yeah, I bet there is. It's super fascinating. So years ago, Peter Goodman's paper did a fabulous thing. It included a folio with the paper one week that was a serialized version of The Great Gatsby. And it said, if you start reading this today, you read the whole piece of it today, by Sunday you will have read The Great Gatsby again. And it was exactly the right amount of chapters from Fitzgerald that matched my train ride from New York at the time. And so by Sunday, I had read The Great Gatsby again completely painlessly. If you go into the Tucker Room at some point and you buy every one of those books, by Christmas time, you will be the world's Nobel-level expert on all of this. So I commend that to you. We'll be back at 1:30 and have a great lunch. Thank you to the panel. Simon Evenett, Carolyn Freund. Thank you.